Inside the Great Pyramid, there is no main thing, no mummy, no treasures, not even wall texts of the kind usually associated with burial complexes. And that is already the first blow to the familiar version. We are told that this is the tomb of Pharaoh Khufu. The Greeks called him Cheops. But if this is a tomb, then where is the body? This question concerns not just one pyramid. More than 100 pyramids are known in Egypt, and in not a single one was the pharaoh himself found. The coincidence looks far too convenient. Now to the numbers. The Great Pyramid consists of about 2,300,000 blocks. The average weight of one block is about 2.5 tons. Its original height reached almost 146 meters. The base has a side length of about 230 meters. The deviation from a perfect square is only a few centimeters. That is a level of precision that impresses even today. The official version sounds familiar. The pyramid was supposedly built in 20 years. Tens of thousands of people worked on it. They used copper chisels, stone hammers, and wooden devices. There was no wheel. There were no iron tools. There were no lifting cranes either. So far it sounds tolerable. But only until you start counting. If you divide the total number of blocks by 20 years, you get about 315 blocks per day. Every day, without stopping, day and night, for 20 years straight. And this was not just laying them in place. Every block had to be quarried, shaped, transported, lifted, and set almost without error. Especially when you remember that some of the granite was brought from the Aswan area. And that is about 800 kilometers along the Nile. There is also a practical test. At the end of the 20th century, researchers tried quarrying blocks using replicas of ancient tools. The pace turned out to be incomparably lower than what would be required. One block took days of hard labor. But the official scheme requires hundreds of blocks per day. This is where the main break between the textbook and physics begins. By the way, if you are interested in analyses like this, subscribe to the channel. Here we look not at legends, but at numbers, traces, and real materials. Now about granite. This is no longer soft limestone. It is a very hard rock. Copper is too soft for it. In the king's chamber lie enormous granite slabs. Some weigh dozens of tons. But it is not only the weight that matters. The workmanship matters. Engineer Christopher Dunn examined the granite sarcophagus with precise measuring instruments and stated that the inner surfaces are astonishingly even. In his opinion, such precision looks more like machine processing than handwork with copper tools and sand. The scientific community has hardly discussed these conclusions, and that too raises questions. There are oddities of another kind as well. The coordinates of the pyramid are often compared with the speed of light, and the proportions of the structure are linked to the number pi. Some of these coincidences may be accidental. It is important to admit that honestly, but when there are too many coincidences, interest in the object only grows. The pyramid looks not like a crude ancient construction, but like a structure in which geometry was fundamental. The most controversial point in the whole story is connected with the name of Khufu. The main evidence is considered to be the inscription in the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. It was discovered by the Briton Howard Vyse in the 19th century. The problem is that the chambers were opened brutally, in places with the help of explosions, and some of the finds appeared under extremely awkward circumstances. Later, critics pointed to oddities in the inscription itself and to the dubious history of the discovery. Because of this, Khufu's cartouche touche became for many not proof, but a subject of dispute. This is where the alternative hypothesis arises. The French researcher Joseph Davidovits suggested that some of the blocks were not cut out, but cast like artificial stone. His supporters point to chemical differences in samples and to the microstructure of some blocks. Such a version explains the tight fit and the rapid pace of the work. But it does not explain everything. The granite elements still remain a serious mystery. They cannot simply be cast on site. That is exactly why the debate around the Great Pyramid does not die down. Too much precision, too little direct evidence, too many questions for the official scheme. And from here on, one must look not at loud claims but at the stone, the traces of processing, and the real methods that could have left all this behind. Granite does not forgive mistakes. It is an igneous rock. It is born deep underground, at temperatures above 600 degrees. And yet in the Great Pyramid lie thousands of tons of worked granite. The surfaces there are so, even that we are talking about hundredths of a millimeter. For the ancient world, that sounds almost defiant. In March 1999, the pyramid was closed to visitors. Officially, restoration was underway, but engineers with endoscopes were allowed inside. These were flexible cameras for inspecting narrow cavities and mechanisms. They were sent into the so-called ventilation shafts. In reality, these are extremely tight channels, about 20 centimeters wide. No person could crawl through them. In the southern shaft of the Queen's chamber, about 60 meters, from the entrance the camera ran into a stone slab. 2 copper pins protruded from the slab. Egyptologists called the find a door. In 2002, a robot drilled through the slab. Behind it was another one. Then that one was open too. Beyond it was empty space and strange red symbols on the wall. What those signs are is still unclear. The images were never published. The public was shown only a blurry frame at a press conference. More than 20 years have passed. No clear report, no open analysis, no convincing explanation. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not legends, but the most inconvenient facts. In 2005, the French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin proposed a new version of the pyramid's internal design. He studied its structure using microgravimetry. This method detects tiny changes in the gravitational field. Dense stone pulls more strongly. Empty space, less so. The data showed an anomaly. Inside the pyramid there may be a spiral system of voids. Houdin concluded that this was an internal ramp for lifting blocks. Not outside, but inside. The theory is elegant but inconvenient. If such a ramp exists, why has it not been found in 200 years of research? Houdin himself answered simply. The ramp was sealed up after construction. And here, the most uncomfortable question arises. Why hide a construction passage at all if it was no longer needed? That makes sense in only one case. If something else was hidden behind the masonry. In November 2017, the Scan Pyramids project announced a sensation. Physicists from Japan, France, and Egypt used muon tomography. This is how volcanoes and nuclear reactors are scanned. Muons pass through matter, and their flux changes, depending on the density of the material. The scan revealed a large unknown cavity above the Grand Gallery. Its length is no less than 30 meters, possibly more. It is a huge hidden chamber, almost in the center of the pyramid. The authorities urged people not to rush to conclusions. Years have passed since then. But drilling has not been authorized. Access there remains closed. The cavity exists. That is acknowledged. But finding out what is inside is still not allowed. Even earlier, in 1881, William Flinders Petrie conducted the first truly precise survey of the pyramid. In the granite sarcophagus of the king's chamber, he noticed parallel grooves. Their depth was about 0.5 millimeter. The spacing between them was exactly 2.5 millimeters. The marks were too regular for handwork. Petrie drew a conclusion. They had been left by a rotating tool with a fixed cutting edge. Near the pyramid he also found stone fragments with perfectly round holes. Along the walls ran a spiral groove with the same spacing. These were traces of drilling. Petrie's calculations were troubling. To produce such a mark, either a pressure of 2 tons or a speed of about 500 revolutions per minute, would be required. Neither can be done by hand. Later, the American engineer Chris Dunn re-examined these findings with modern instruments, and he confirmed the main point. The marks do not fit a simple scheme of copper, sand, and manual labor. And this is where the most uncomfortable part begins. If the granite in the pyramid was indeed worked using a method that we still cannot honestly reproduce with ancient tools, then the question is no longer how the pyramid was built. The question is different. What exactly did its builders know? And why are some of the answers still hidden inside the stone? Now pause for a second and look at how strangely the picture comes together. On the one hand, we have granite cores and machining marks that anyone can see in the London Museum. They can be measured, they can be compared, and, if one wishes, Petrie's and Dunn's experiments can be repeated. But almost no one talks about this. It is not written about in textbooks. It is not discussed at major conferences. The collection seems to exist and not exist at the same time. Even though it is quite real, it lies on the shelves and silently poses an uncomfortable question. If such technologies were known to ancient craftsmen, then where did they disappear to afterward? And here an even more disturbing thought arises. What if these were not Egyptians at all? In 2005, new excavations began beneath the Great Pyramid. Officially, archaeologists were studying underground chambers that Herodotus had written about 2,500 years earlier. The work proceeded under difficult conditions. According to a surviving entry from the personal diary of one of the participants, they first went down a vertical shaft to a depth of 12 meters. The air there was heavy, almost motionless. There were no paintings or inscriptions on the walls, only bare stone. At a depth of 15 meters, a narrow horizontal corridor opened up, about a meter wide. They had to walk bent over. After 40 meters, the archaeologist entered a small chamber, about 4 by 4 meters. In the center was some kind of object, and here the entry suddenly breaks off. The next entry appeared only 9 days later. It no longer contained a word about the find, only dry notes about ventilation and soil. After that, the excavation was quickly shut down. The official reason sounded familiar: lack of funding. The entrance to the shaft was sealed with concrete. The subject disappeared, but not entirely. According to a man who worked security at the excavation, a small box was brought up from the shaft, wooden, reinforced with metal, about the size of a shoebox, very old. It was taken away immediately, not to the Cairo Museum, not to the storage facilities of the Ministry of Antiquities. At least, no records of that were ever found. The box simply vanished. Years later, a man appeared who claimed to have seen its contents. His name was Ahmed. He had worked for many years as a restoration technician at the Cairo Museum, from the early 90s until 2011. In 2018, he contacted an independent researcher from Germany. He said only this: "I need to tell this while I am still alive." They met in Hurghada, a noisy, touristy place, convenient for anonymity. The conversation was recorded on a voice recorder. Copies were distributed to several people, in case the original disappeared. According to Ahmed, in April 2005, he was summoned without explanation to an administrative building of the ministry. There were 3 men in the office. 2 were officials. He had never seen the third before, an elderly European, gray-haired, in an expensive suit. He spoke Arabic with a noticeable accent, possibly French. That same box was on the table. Ahmed was told only one thing: the contents had to be preserved. You will work alone. Not a word to anyone. When the box was opened, inside were several layers of nearly decayed linen cloth. Ahmed removed them with tweezers, layer by layer. Under the cloth was an object, metallic, about the size of an adult man's palm, flat, about a centimeter thick. The shape was irregular, but close to a rectangle with rounded corners. The surface was perfectly smooth, almost like glass. The color was dark gray, with a faint metallic sheen. Not gold, not silver, not bronze, and not iron. On one side there was a pattern. Geometric, lines, circles, dots, too even, too precise. For handwork it looked suspiciously complex. By the way, if details like this interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine exactly the kinds of oddities that usually remain outside official versions. Ahmed took the object in his hands and immediately noticed two things. It was heavier than it looked, and it was warm. Not room temperature, warmer, as if someone had been holding it very recently, even though, according to him, the box had been standing closed for several hours. Then Ahmed carried out the usual working procedures. He photographed the find, measured it, wrote down the data. Weight, 412 grams. Length, 15 centimeters. Width, 9. Thickness, 11 millimeters. And then the main thing happened. Ahmed had a small magnet with him. He often carried it for quick metal checks. He brought the magnet close to the surface of the object, and the magnet was not attracted. But neither was it repelled. It hung in the air, about a centimeter from the object. It remained motionless for several seconds. Then it fell. Ahmed repeated the experiment. The result was the same. Again and again. This is where the story stops being merely strange. It becomes almost impossible. If the account is true, then what we have here is not an ordinary ancient artifact. Ahmed did not claim to understand the nature of the phenomenon, but he immediately understood something else. This thing was unlike anything he had seen in 20 years of work. The next day, the object was taken away. The same European came. With him were two men in plain clothes. The box was silently packed into a metal case and carried off. Ahmed was ordered to forget everything. The documentation was destroyed right in front of him. The papers were burned in a metal bucket, but he managed to save the photographs. He made copies before handing over the camera. According to the German researchers, they saw those images. The quality was poor, old equipment, but the main thing was visible, that same geometric pattern. And they claim it resembles a microchip. Yes, it sounds wild. A metal object with a pattern, resembling a printed circuit board, about 4,500 years old, found beneath the Great Pyramid. But if you break it all down point by point, the story rests on several stubborn details. First, the object was allegedly found in a sealed chamber at a depth of 15 meters. Second, its material could not be identified by ordinary inspection. Third, it behaved strangely near a magnet. Fourth, its surface bore a complex repeating pattern of an engineering type. Either Ahmed made it all up, or something was indeed found beneath the pyramid that shatters the usual chronology of technology. And this is not the only story of its kind. In 1936, the British engineer Walter Bryan Emery was working at Saqqara, about 30 kilometers from Giza. There he discovered unusual stone discs, flat, round, about 30 centimeters in diameter, with a hole in the center. Spiral grooves ran across their surface, almost like on a gramophone record. The discs were sent to the Cairo Museum and forgotten for a long time. Many years later, the young Egyptologist Zakaria Ghanem noticed their strange regularity. The grooves ran in a continuous spiral from the center to the edge. He proposed checking whether information had been recorded on them. Soon afterward, he was removed, formally, for violating protocol. Later, he died under mysterious circumstances, and the discs themselves remained in storage. Now the connection becomes clearer. There and here alike, we see objects that do not look like ritual symbols, but like elements of some function, like parts of a system. And this brings us back to the main question. What if the pyramid was not a tomb, but a machine? That is exactly the version proposed by engineer Christopher Dunn. He drew attention to the fact that the king's chamber is made of granite rich in quartz. Quartz has a piezoelectric effect. Under pressure, it can create an electric charge, and the pressure inside the pyramid is colossal. Millions of tons of stone above. Above the king's chamber are 5 so-called relieving chambers. Officially, they distribute the weight, but Dunn proposed something else. They are resonators. Chambers of different sizes, and therefore different frequencies. He believed that the pyramid could collect and amplify vibrations. The shafts did not serve for ventilation, but as waveguides. The Grand Gallery functioned as an acoustic amplifier, and the Granite King's Chamber became an energy node. Even the famous sarcophagus, in this version, ceases to be a coffin. It turns into a functional element of the system, possibly a charge accumulator. The theory is controversial, but it tries to explain real oddities. Why there is no soot inside the Great Pyramid, even though the builders should have used fire. Why the sarcophagus is wider than the passage, and therefore must have been installed before construction was completed. Why some chambers have salt deposits while neighboring ones do not. Dunn believed that chemical processes could have taken place inside, perhaps even involving the release of hydrogen. And here, everything runs into the most dangerous question. Who created this system at all, if it really existed? In 1993, geologist Robert Schoch closely studied the Sphinx and concluded that the erosion marks on its body were left not only by wind-blown dust, but also by heavy water action. Vertical grooves, deep runoff channels, the nature of the rock's destruction. This does not fit well with Egypt in historical times. Such rains fell there a very long time ago, before the age of the pharaohs, possibly many thousands of years before them. If Schoch is right, then the Sphinx may be far older than the official dating. And if the Sphinx is older, then the entire familiar picture of Giza is called into question, and then the granite growths, the strange discs, the vanished box, and the warm metallic object beneath the pyramid no longer look like a random set of anomalies. They begin to form a single line, a line that leads to a thought that makes many people uneasy. Perhaps the Egyptians did not create all of this from scratch. Perhaps they inherited part of the knowledge, or part of the structures, from a much more ancient civilization. After the last ice age, sea level rose by about 120 meters. This did not take a single century. For millennia, wave after wave came. Glaciers melted. Glacial lakes burst through. Giant floods and tsunamis crashed onto the coasts. And it was precisely to this time that Plato dated the destruction of Atlantis. Whether that is a coincidence or not, everyone decides for themselves. But something else is more important. In 2016, researchers from Germany and Egypt studied the mortar in the pyramid. That very binding substance between the blocks. Radiocarbon analysis gave an age of 4,000 to 5,000 years. This fits the official Egyptian dating. Everything looked calm. And then another study appeared. In the same year, a Ukrainian group took organic samples from the blocks themselves. Here people recall the controversial but well-known hypothesis of geopolymer concrete. If the blocks were not only quarried, but also partially cast, algae, plant fragments, and other organic impurities could have gotten inside. The analysis showed a completely different range, from 7,000 to 12,000 years. The gap is enormous, 12-fold, and in some places even 3-fold. And this is where the most uncomfortable part begins. If both analyses are correct, then the mortar is younger than the blocks themselves, which means the blocks could have existed long before they were bonded together. And then a bold version is born. The Egyptians did not build the pyramid from scratch, but restored a much older structure. They renewed the masonry, added chambers, adapted the complex to their rituals and funerary cults. For all its controversial nature, this version tries to close old questions. Why the Egyptians left thousands of scenes from everyday life but almost never showed the actual process of lifting multi-ton blocks. Why? They spoke in detail about tombs, but remained silent about key engineering solutions. Why we have so few clear technical descriptions of the construction of the Great Pyramids, specifically. The answer from supporters of this theory is simple: because they were not the first builders. And from here, the next thread extends. The object Ahmet spoke about could not have come out of nowhere. If it really lay in a sealed space beneath a mass of stone, then someone hid it there deliberately, not by accident, not yesterday, and possibly not the Egyptians. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not legends, but the strangest intersections of facts, dates, and discoveries. In 1993, German engineer Rudolf Gantenbrink sent a robot into the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber. The robot was called Upuat. This is the name of an ancient Egyptian deity, a guide of paths. At a distance of about 63 meters, the device ran into a stone slab. There were 2 copper pins in it. Later, this barrier was called Gantenbrink's door. Then things became strange. The research was abruptly stopped. The engineer himself was removed. The materials were sealed off. For almost 9 years, no one returned to this slab. Only in 2002, after strong public pressure, did a new robot drill through the first slab. Behind it was a second one. They drilled through that as well. Behind it, they found a small empty space and markings on the wall. The official explanation sounded routine: red paint, construction marks left by workers. But one of the participants in the filming later told a journalist that it looked different, not like ordinary marks. According to him, there were symbols there. They stood in rows, almost like a record, and they were not the familiar Egyptian hieroglyphs. High-quality photographs were never shown to the public. Decades passed. The question remained: what exactly did the camera see behind that slab? And now the gaze shifts far from Egypt. In 1994, excavations began at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. Before that, the site had been considered an ordinary hill and was even taken for a later cemetery. But archaeologist Klaus Schmidt dug deeper, and beneath the ground, there turned out to be a temple complex of incredible antiquity. Huge T-shaped pillars, up to 6 meters high, weighing from 10 to 20 tons. Foxes, snakes, birds, predators are carved on them. Radiocarbon analysis showed an age of about 11 or 12,000 years. That is roughly 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and much older than the Egyptian pyramids, according to the official chronology. In fact, Göbekli Tepe overturned the previous idea of what people at the end of the Ice Age were capable of. And the most curious thing is this: some of the pillars bear repeating geometric signs: a circle with a dot, parallel lines with a crossbar, spiral forms. Yes, geometry by itself proves nothing yet. Such symbols could have appeared independently. But if similar signs really were behind Gantenbrink's door as well, the picture becomes far more interesting. Then we get not just a set of mysteries, but possible traces of one very ancient tradition. One language of symbols, or, if you like, one cultural code stretching from deep antiquity across different regions. What do we know for certain? About 12,000 years ago, Earth's climate was changing sharply. The Ice Age was ending. Sea levels were rising. Entire landscapes were disappearing. At the same time, the monumental sanctuaries of Göbekli Tepe were already standing in Anatolia. And then history seems to fall into a gap. After that, for a long time, there are almost no structures of comparable scale, and only millennia later do the early civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley appear. From this comes the hypothesis that academic science considers highly controversial: that before the civilizations known to us, there may have existed an earlier advanced culture. Not necessarily one like ours, but organized enough to erect megaliths, workstone, and transmit complex knowledge. Then catastrophe came. Floods. The impact of a celestial body. A sudden climatic collapse. What exactly, no one knows. The culture vanished. Only fragments remained. Stone, symbols, and perhaps hidden objects. If so, then the pyramids may have been not simply tombs, but later reinterpreted structures with a different original function. Machines, temples, astronomical complexes, or something for which we still do not have an exact word. And that is why every new discovery inside a pyramid provokes not only interest, but fear. Because it may strike not just one detail, but the entire familiar picture of the past. If this is true, then we are no longer talking about a single strange find. We are talking about an entire chain of disappearances. Fossilized rock was found around the ceramic cylinder. Geologists estimated its age at about 500,000 years. An X-ray revealed a wire spiral inside. The structure resembled a spark plug. The artifact was studied for several years. Then everything stopped. Publications ceased. The stone itself vanished. And since then, no one has clearly explained where it is. And this is where the main question arises. Why do such things disappear from view again and again? One object is lost in transit. Another ends up in a private collection. A third suddenly stops being discussed. When cases like this happen many times, people begin to see not coincidence, but a system. Who exactly stands behind it is impossible to say for sure. It could be closed circles of influence. It could be officials, foundations, intermediaries, archive owners. What matters is something else. The motive of such a system is quite understandable. If it were ever officially acknowledged that ancient structures were created, not by those our textbooks tell us they were, the consequences would be enormous. The history of civilizations would have to be revised. The origin of technology would have to be debated anew. Old scientific models would come under attack, and millions of people would be left with one simple and heavy question. Who then can we trust at all? And this is no longer just a dispute among archaeologists. It is a blow to the entire picture of the world. From this logic, another version also emerges. If the pyramid was not only a monument, but also a device, then what is at stake is energy, and not ordinary energy, but clean, almost free energy, possibly based on the Earth's resonance. If we allow that possibility even for a minute, it becomes clear who would not benefit from it. Oil companies, gas corporations, the vast energy industry where trillions of dollars circulate every year. I am not saying that specific tycoons personally hide artifacts, but it would be naive to deny the interest of powerful forces in controlling energy. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine exactly those places where official versions begin to crack. But there is hope in this story too. The very symbols that link Gantenbrink's door and Göbekli Tepe surfaced in one more source. In 2014, a group of independent researchers from Russia gained access to old Egyptian archival photographs. Among them was a photograph taken in 1925, during the period of Howard Carter's expedition. The image showed the wall of an underground chamber from another site, not from Tutankhamun's tomb, and the entire wall turned out to be covered with familiar symbols. They saw a circle with a dot, parallel lines with a crossbar, a spiral of 7 turns. But something else was more important. There was a diagram on the wall, a large one, almost 2 square meters, lines, rectangles, circles, connections. The researchers showed the image to several engineers and gave them no context at all. The answers turned out to be strikingly similar. They all said the same thing. It was an electrical circuit. One specialist in high-frequency technology specified it even more precisely. In his opinion, what he saw was a complex resonant circuit designed to operate in the range from 50 to 200 Hertz. And that is exactly the range that supporters of the pyramid as machine theory associate with its possible operation. The coincidence looks too precise to simply dismiss. If the diagram is authentic, then this is no longer an ornament or a ritual drawing. It is an instruction, a message to those who would come later, an attempt to preserve knowledge after a catastrophe. And then the most disturbing part begins. The photograph is considered the only copy. The negative was destroyed. The expedition records for that period are missing. The chamber where the photograph was taken has not been officially identified. It may have been filled in, walled up, or destroyed altogether. But the image itself survived, and it continues to be studied. That is why the story is not over. The truth has not disappeared completely. It breaks through in isolated pieces of evidence, through archival photographs, through eyewitness accounts, through scientists and engineers willing to risk their reputations for the sake of uncomfortable questions. And every such case matters, because great changes almost always begin not with official recognition, but with a small crack in the wall of silence. Look at how this has happened before. When Robert Schoch spoke about traces of water erosion on the Sphinx, he was harshly criticized. Today, the very idea of the Sphinx being far older no longer seems marginal. When engineering theories about the functional purpose of the pyramids first appeared, they were ridiculed. Now these calculations are discussed much more seriously. Slowly, reluctantly, but they are discussed. That means pressure works. And that is why not only archives and discoveries matter, but ordinary people as well, those who ask questions, those who do not accept ready-made answers on faith, those who spread information further. One voice changes little, but thousands of voices already create noise, and millions force answers. History knows such moments. Old structures seem eternal, until suddenly they begin to collapse very quickly. The pyramid survived pharaohs, empires, wars, and conquests. It will survive those who today control access to knowledge as well. And if a message is truly encoded in its stone, then it is addressed not to the priests of the past, but to us, to those who are capable of comparing facts, to those who know how to doubt, to those who are ready to admit that the ancient world may have been far more complex than we were told. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. See you again soon.